If you've ever wondered about the hidden legends who shaped American music history, the unsung heroes of blues guitar whose influence ripples through generations of musicians, then this is a story you need to hear. Today, we're diving deep into the life of a woman who picked up a guitar at 3 years old and didn't put it down for nearly 90 years. A Piedmont blues master whose fingers danced across strings with a grace that would inspire everyone from Bob Dylan to Taj Mahal, yet whose name remained largely unknown for decades. This is the story of Etta Baker, a musical treasure hidden in plain sight, a woman whose life was marked by profound loss and extraordinary resilience, and whose contribution to the American musical landscape cannot be overstated. Her journey takes us from the tobacco fields of North Carolina to the stages where she finally received the recognition she deserved, and along the way, we'll discover how one woman's dedication to her craft became a bridge between generations and a testament to the power of music to heal, to inspire, and to endure. Etta Lucille Reed came into this world on March 31st, 1913, in Caldwell County, North Carolina, born into a family that carried the complex tapestry of American heritage in their veins. Her ancestry was a blend of African American, Native American, and European American roots, a mixture that reflected the complicated history of the South itself. But what defined Etta from her earliest days wasn't her heritage on paper. It was the music that seemed to flow through her like a river finding its course. At an age when most children are just learning to speak in full sentences, 3-year-old Etta was already reaching for her father's guitar, her tiny fingers somehow finding their way around the instrument that would become her lifelong companion. Her father, Boone Reed, recognized something special in his daughter, something that couldn't be taught but could be nurtured, and he became her only instructor, the sole teacher she would ever need. There's something profound about that relationship, about a father passing down not just technique, but soul, not just chords, but a way of understanding the world through 6 strings and a wooden body. The Reed family didn't stay in Caldwell County for long. When Etta was just 3 years old, the same year she first picked up that guitar, they moved to Keysville, Virginia in 1916. Life wasn't easy for the Reed family, not by any stretch of the imagination. Boone Reed worked whatever jobs he could find to support his family, and there were plenty of mouths to feed. 8 children in total, 8 souls that needed clothing and food and shelter, and eventually the family found themselves working on a tobacco farm, their hands stained with the leaves that would become someone else's luxury while they scraped by on whatever wages they could earn. This was the reality for so many black families in the South during those years, a grinding existence where music became not just entertainment but survival, a way to make the unbearable bearable, to find beauty in a world that often seemed determined to crush it out of you. Young Etta absorbed all of this, the struggle and the music intertwined, inseparable, each giving meaning to the other. Education, like so many things for families like the Reeds, was a luxury that sometimes had to be sacrificed for more immediate needs. Etta made it through 10th grade before she had to drop out, her formal education ending, but her real education, the one that mattered most to her, continuing every time she picked up that guitar. Her father's lessons had planted seeds that would grow throughout her entire life, and while she might not have had diplomas or certificates, she had something far more valuable. She had a connection to the instrument that went beyond technique, beyond theory, beyond anything that could be taught in a classroom. Years later, she would describe how inspiration came to her through dreams, how she would wake up with chord progressions in her mind, putting them together like a crossword puzzle, piece by piece, until the picture became clear. There's something almost mystical about that, the way music would visit her in sleep, as if the blues itself was speaking directly to her subconscious, bypassing all the noise and clutter of waking life to deliver its messages pure and unfiltered. Love found Etta in the form of Lee Baker, a piano player who understood the language she spoke, the language of music that transcended words. They courted for 6 years, a long and patient courtship that spoke to the seriousness with which they approached their commitment to each other. In 1936, they married, two musicians joining their lives together, and over the years they would have 9 children. Imagine that household, filled with the sounds of guitar and piano, with the voices of children, with all the chaos and beauty that comes from a large family trying to make their way in a world that wasn't always kind to them. Lee and Etta made music together, their instruments complementing each other, his piano providing foundation, while her guitar wove intricate patterns above it. They were partners in every sense of the word, building a life together note by note, day by day, year by year. The summer of 1956 brought an encounter that would change the trajectory of Etta's musical legacy, though she couldn't have known it at the time. She and her father were at the Cone Mansion in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, when they met a folk singer named Paul Clayton. Clayton was part of the folk revival movement that was beginning to sweep through America, urban intellectuals and musicians discovering or rediscovering the traditional music that had been kept alive in rural communities, often by people like Etta, who played not for fame or fortune, but because the music was simply part of who they were. Clayton recognized immediately what he was hearing when Etta played. This wasn't some amateur strumming, this was mastery, a fully developed style that carried the weight of tradition while remaining utterly unique to her. He arranged for recordings to be made, and 5 solo guitar pieces by Etta were released on an album called Instrumental Music of the Southern Appalachians in 1956. Among those pieces was One Dime Blues, a song that would become her signature, a piece of music so perfectly crafted, so emotionally resonant, that it would influence generations of musicians who came after her. But here's where the story takes a turn that's all too familiar for Black musicians of that era, a pattern of exploitation that robbed so many artists of the fruits of their labor. Etta was not compensated for those early recordings. Think about that for a moment. She poured her soul into those performances, shared the music that had been passed down from her father, the music she had spent decades perfecting, and she received nothing for it. No payment, no royalties, no recognition beyond her name on an album that most people would never hear. This wasn't unusual, sadly. The folk revival and the blues revival that followed were built in large part on the backs of Black musicians who were treated as anthropological specimens rather than artists deserving of fair compensation. It would be years before Etta would get the rights to her music back, and that would only happen through the intervention of the Music Maker label, an organization dedicated to helping traditional musicians receive what they were owed. The injustice of it burns even now, decades later, a reminder of how systemic racism operated not just through violence and segregation, but through the quiet theft of intellectual property and artistic labor. Despite the lack of recognition and compensation, Etta continued to play, continued to develop her craft, because the music wasn't about money or fame for her. It was about something deeper, something essential to her being. Her style was pure Piedmont blues, a regional variant characterized by a finger-picking technique that created a steady rhythmic bass line with the thumb, while the fingers picked out melody and harmony on the higher strings. It's a complex style that requires both hands to work independently, creating the illusion of 2 guitars playing at once, and Etta had mastered it so completely that it seemed effortless when she played. Her fingers would dance across the fretboard, finding notes and chords that seemed to shimmer in the air, creating music that was simultaneously ancient and fresh, traditional and innovative. She wasn't trying to reinvent the blues, she was honoring it, keeping it alive, passing it forward. The year 1967 brought devastation that would have broken many people. Etta lost her son in the Vietnam War, a young man sent halfway around the world to fight in a conflict that tore America apart, and he never came home. The grief of losing a child is something that defies description, a wound that never fully heals, and for Etta it was compounded by the fact that in that same year her husband Lee died as well. In the span of 12 months, she lost her son and her partner, the piano player who had courted her for 6 years and shared her life for more than 3 decades. Her style was pure Piedmont blues, a regional variant characterized The music that had always been her companion suddenly felt too heavy to bear. She stopped playing for a while, the guitar sitting silent, because how could she make music when the world had taken so much from her? How could she find beauty when everything felt like ashes? But grief has a strange way of working. Sometimes the very thing we push away is the thing we need most. Etta found herself missing the consolation that the blues brought her, missing the way the music could hold her pain and transform it into something that, if not beautiful, was at least bearable. The blues had always been about taking suffering and giving it form, about acknowledging the hardness of life while refusing to be destroyed by it. Slowly, she picked up the guitar again. Her fingers found the strings, found the chords that came to her in dreams, and she began to play again. The music hadn't abandoned her, and she realized she couldn't abandon it either. It was too much a part of who she was, too essential to her survival. In returning to the guitar, she was honoring her father who had taught her, honoring her husband who had made music with her, honoring her son whose memory deserved to be carried forward in song. The world was changing, slowly, and with that change came a growing recognition of the artists who had been overlooked for so long. The folk and blues revivals of the 1960s and 70s had introduced a new generation to traditional American music, and some of those young musicians were digging deeper, trying to find the sources, the wellsprings from which this music flowed. They discovered Etta Baker, this woman in Virginia who had been playing Piedmont blues for decades, whose recordings from 1956 were treasures waiting to be unearthed. Musicians like Bob Dylan, Taj Mahal, and Kenny Wayne Shepherd found inspiration in her playing, in the purity of her style and the depth of her feeling. Here was someone who hadn't been corrupted by commercial considerations, who hadn't smoothed out the rough edges to make her music more palatable to mainstream audiences. She played the blues the way they were meant to be played, with honesty and skill and soul. Recognition, when it finally came, arrived in forms that must have seemed surreal to someone who had spent most of her life in obscurity. In 1991, Etta received the National Heritage Fellowship, one of the highest honors the United States government bestows on traditional artists. It was an acknowledgement, decades late, but no less meaningful, that her contribution to American culture was significant and worthy of celebration. She was in her late 70s by then, an age when many people have long since retired, but Etta was just getting started on a new phase of her career. She began performing more widely, appearing at festivals and concerts, finally getting to share her music with audiences who appreciated what they were hearing. The collaborations that followed were testament to the respect she commanded among her fellow musicians. Taj Mahal, himself a blues legend, sought her out to record together, recognizing in her a kindred spirit and a master of the form. Kenny Wayne Shepherd, a guitarist from a much younger generation, did the same, understanding that playing with Etta Baker was like touching a living piece of history, a direct connection to the roots of American music. These later years of recognition and collaboration must have been bittersweet. On one hand, Etta was finally receiving the acknowledgement she had always deserved, finally being compensated fairly for her music, finally being treated as the artist she had always been. On the other hand, she had spent the majority of her life in obscurity, raising 9 children, working to survive, playing her guitar in relative anonymity, while others built careers on the foundation that musicians like her had laid. There's no way to give back those lost years, no way to compensate for the decades when her genius went largely unrecognized. But Etta didn't seem to carry bitterness about it. In interviews from her later years, she comes across as someone who found joy in the music itself, who played because she had to, because it was as natural to her as breathing. The recognition was nice, certainly, but it wasn't why she played. She played because the blues had chosen her just as surely as she had chosen the blues, and that relationship was its own reward. Etta Baker continued playing well into her 90s, her fingers still finding those chords that came to her in dreams, still putting together the crossword puzzle of melody and harmony that had fascinated her since she was 3 years old. Nearly 90 years of playing, of keeping the Piedmont blues alive, of passing the tradition forward to anyone who would listen. She had outlived her husband by nearly 4 decades, had survived the loss of her son, had raised 8 other children to adulthood, had worked tobacco fields, and endured poverty and racism and all the countless indignities that came with being a black woman in America during the 20th century. Through it all, the guitar had been her constant companion, her consolation, her voice when words weren't enough. On September 23, 2006, Etta Baker died at the age of 93 in Fairfax, Virginia. She was visiting her daughter who had suffered a stroke, still caring for her children even in her 90s, still putting family first the way she always had. It's fitting, in a way, that she died while caring for someone else, that her last act was one of love and service. She had lived a life defined by such acts, by the quiet heroism of showing up day after day, of making music even when no one was listening, of keeping faith with the tradition her father had passed down to her. Her death marked the end of an era, the passing of one of the last direct links to the early days of Piedmont blues, but her music lives on. Those recordings, the ones she finally got the rights to, the ones she made later in life when she was finally being compensated fairly, they preserve her voice, her style, her genius for anyone who wants to hear it. The story of Etta Baker is the story of American music itself, with all its beauty and all its injustice. It's a story about how art survives despite systemic oppression, about how talent and dedication can persist even when they're not rewarded, about how the human spirit finds ways to express itself no matter the obstacles. It's also a story about how we fail our artists, particularly our black artists, particularly our women artists, how we take from them without giving back, how we discover them only when it's almost too late. But it's ultimately a story of triumph, of a woman who played the guitar for nearly 90 years because she loved it, because it was part of her, because the blues demanded to be played, and she was the one chosen to play them. Her influence ripples outward still, touching musicians who never met her, inspiring people who discover her recordings decades after her death. That's the power of real artistry, of music made with honesty and skill and soul. It doesn't die when the artist dies. It lives on, finding new ears, new hearts, new hands to pick up guitars and carry the tradition forward. Etta Baker did that. She kept the flame alive, and in doing so, she gave us all a gift that can never be repaid, only honored by listening, by remembering, by telling her story to anyone who will hear it. That's all for today. Don't forget to subscribe and be kind to each other.